I will explain the process from the Russo-Japanese War to the Pacific War. In the previous issue, I explained the formation of the Imperial Army. In this issue, I will explain the power struggle between the Imperial Way faction and the Control faction. The Imperial Way faction was a group led by Sadao Araki that advocated national reform with a pro-emperor agenda. They were supported by lower-ranking young officers. In contrast, the Control faction, led by Tetsuzan Nagata, was a group that aimed to reform the nation through legal means. They were supported mainly by elite officers who had graduated from military college. It was the imperialists who first took the initiative. There was one person, Kimuro Hashimoto. He had graduated from military college and had been stationed in Turkey. During this time, he was exposed to the revolutionary ideas of Mustafa Kemal, which increased his passion for revolution. He formed the Sakurakai, a secret society that aimed to make Japan a military state and build a winged parliament. He planned and failed in a coup d'état in March 1930 that installed Agaki, Minister of War, as Prime Minister. This is known as the March Incident. In the same year, a coup d'état was planned to install Araki, an Imperial Way faction member, as Prime Minister, which also failed. This was called the October Incident. The attempted coup had a number of effects. One was the fall of the Wakatsuki cabinet. Another was that Araki's Imperial Way faction replaced Agaki's faction and took control of the leadership within the army. And the only punishment for those involved in the coup was too light, allowing the army to run amok later. The Wakatsuki cabinet was succeeded by the rigid Inukai cabinet. He appointed Sadao Araki as Minister of War. The appointment of Araki, who was popular within the army, was intended to allay dissatisfaction within the army. After becoming Minister of War, Araki appointed people from his own faction to important posts within the army. He also recruited many radical young officers of his own faction to a division stationed in Tokyo. Now, Araki, who became Minister of Land, was, to put it bluntly, an incompetent man. He had little political experience and was unable to organize budget negotiations in the cabinet. He had the cause of aiming for the emperor's filial piety, but he did not have the skills to actually carry it out. Therefore, the radical young officers who supported him demanded that Araki carry it out. Araki, however, took the side of the young officers in punishing their actions, and he rapidly lost their support. Thus, radical young officers took action to change Japan with their own hands. Unlike the control elite, these young officers were not familiar with world affairs and did not have a concrete plan. They had the idea of changing Japan by sacrificing themselves for loyalty to the emperor and without regard for the consequences. In other words, they believed that Emperor Showa would surely make Japan a better place if they eliminated the schemers around him. Thus, young officers took action to change Japan through revolution, as in the assassination of Prime Minister Inuyo in May 1932. Young officers from the Army and Navy, led by Naval Officer Mikami, lured the Prime Minister, Tsuyoshi Inukai, to his home and shot him. They were arrested, and at their trial Mikami thoroughly denounced the corruption of politicians and high-ranking military officers. He stated that he had been forced to kill Inukai because of the emperor's pro-government policies. The prosecution sought the death penalty for the ringleaders, but the trial was surprisingly light, and the judge even praised them for their patriotic aspirations. The public also praised the young officers for their actions in the service of their country, without regard to the possibility of the death penalty for themselves. As a result, the young officers believed that their actions were not wrong and escalated their behavior. The assassination of the Prime Minister led to the complete dysfunction of Japanese politics and the beginning of political leadership by the military. Politicians believed that they would be killed if they defied the military's wishes, and parliamentary politics came to an end. What was the Control faction doing at this time? Nagata, a member of the Control faction, and Araki, a member of the Imperial Way faction, were completely at odds on the war policy. The army had basically assumed the Soviet Union as its virtual enemy even after the Russo-Japanese War. Araki, who disliked communism, believed that preparations for war with the Soviets had to be made first. The majority of the army held this view. Nagata, however, alone believed that war with China must be waged before the Soviets. The two then had a heated discussion at an army conference in 1933. Nagata said, "To fight the Soviets, we must work together with China. To do so, we must use force once to make China listen to Japan." Araki countered. He asked, "Can we easily solve China by force? If China and Japan fight, the West will not keep quiet. It would surely turn into a world war." It was also a war policy battle between the Control faction and the Imperial Way faction, whether to fight the Soviets or the Chinese. In 1934, Araki, who had lost the support of young officers and was abandoned by army leaders due to his poor political skills, resigned as Minister of War, citing illness. Araki recommended Masaki, an Imperial Way faction member, as his successor, but this did not pass, and Masaki became Superintendent General of Education. Nagata planned to take political power into his own hands. First, he planned to expel the top Imperial Way faction officials within the army. Through this plan, he succeeded in ousting Masaki, who was second only to Araki in the Imperial Way faction. The story was then passed on to the young officers of the Imperial Way faction that this removal of Masaki had been orchestrated by Nagata. In August 1935, Lieutenant Colonel Aizawa, a young Imperial Way faction officer, slashed Tetsuzan Nagata to death with a military sword in the office of the Director General of the Military Affairs Bureau of the Army Ministry. This is known as the Aizawa Incident. Nagata aimed to reform the army so that it could coexist with party politics, and he was considered the only person who could stop the army from running amok. It is said that the Pacific War could have been avoided if he had been there. Hideki Tojo succeeded Nagata as the center of the Control faction. The Aizawa incident removed the main figures of the Imperial Way faction from key positions in the army. It was then decided to move the Tokyo Division, which had many radical young officers recruited by Araki, to Manchuria. Before the young officers of the Tokyo Division moved to Manchuria, there was an incident that occurred, the 2.26 incident. These young officers believed that Japan's current turmoil was due to its deviation from what it should be. They aimed to form a nation centered on the emperor, to eliminate Western-style capitalism, and to expel the Zaibatsu and other privileged classes that were undermining the nation. They occupied Tokyo with 1,400 subordinate officers and several regiments. They attacked Prime Minister Keisuke Okada, Chief of Staff Kantaro Suzuki, Minister of the Interior Minoru Saito, Minister of Finance Kurikyo Takahashi, and others, killing Takahashi and Saito. The young officers petitioned the emperor for the Showa restoration, which would be a new government with a parental authority over the emperor, but the emperor was furious. The Showa emperor was prepared to lead the Konoe division to suppress them himself. Hearing the emperor's determination, the leaders of the army, who were relatively sympathetic to the young officers, called them rebels and were inclined to suppress them. The army leaders, wishing to avoid fighting in the imperial capital, called on young officers to surrender. The young officers, who had no intention of opposing the emperor, accepted the call and surrendered. The young officers had no intention of taking power themselves, and even if the coup was successful, they intended to go belly up to apologize to the emperor. They said, "Failure is death. Success is death." Although it was suspected that many of the bigwigs of the Imperial Way faction were involved in this coup d'état, it was treated as a lone decision by a group of young officers. After the mastermind of the assassination of Prime Minister Inukai presented his theory at the trial, it was accepted by many of the public. The trial was held in complete secrecy so that public support would not be directed against them. They were tried without stating their principles. 17 were sentenced to death for treason. And Tojo, a Control faction member, made the most of this incident. As a result of this incident, almost all Imperial Way faction figures in the army were reassigned to the left. As a result, The leadership of the army was completely taken over by Tojo's control faction. It was also an opportunity for the army to increase its direct interference in the cabinet. This incident marked the beginning of the dictatorship of the Japanese military. In this issue, the power struggle between the Imperial Way faction and the Control faction was the centerpiece of the commentary. There was a radical coup d'état by young officers who were unfamiliar with world affairs and concerned about the impoverished common people. They were also the driving force that resulted in the dictatorship of the Japanese military. In the next article, I will discuss the Quantum Army that triggered the war with China. If you enjoyed this article, please subscribe to our channel and click the like button.